Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 748, and today is January 22nd, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. More news on the very beginning of the Trump era on today's show, so we'll be breaking down some of his executive orders, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Israel. Very important news to get through on today's show. So be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and the best place to follow me for all my work, that's articles, news roundups, op-eds, the Kyle Anzalone show, which is the top link in the show notes page, and you should head on over and go subscribe to, because we'll be doing another episode of that tonight. And the email that I blast out on the Libertarian Institute listserv every day can also be found on my Twitter account. So definitely want to follow me on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, if you aren't already. And with that, let's get into today's show. First article up here is one I wrote for the Institute on January 21st. Trump orders 50 former intel officials stripped of security clearance over election interference. So Donald Trump signed an executive order that strips 50 former U.S. intelligence officials of their security clearance. Trump said the former officials had interfered in the 2020 election by coordinating with the Joe Biden campaign to discredit an important story involving Hunter Biden's scandals. So in October of 2020, the New York Post reported that Joe Biden's son Hunter had abandoned a laptop at a computer supply shop. Discovered on the device were pictures showing Hunter engaging in criminal and embarrassing actions, as well as emails suggesting high-level corruption involving his father. Following the release of the bombshell story, a group of 51 former intelligence officials issued a letter claiming they assessed the laptop was Russian disinformation aimed at altering the outcome of the upcoming election. Subsequently, the Hunter Biden laptop story was heavily censored on Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms. And when we say heavily censored, I think probably in the most significant way a piece of news has ever been censored on social media. Sure, things that are obviously criminal, awful things, probably more censored than the Hunter Biden laptop story. But you could not even send this link in a DM on Twitter. People tried to do that at the time. Myself and, somebody who I had on my show quite a bit at the time, Joanne Leone, tried this a few times, and we could not send this to each other. And so this was an unprecedented level of censorship. And not only, the obvious censorship of, I can't send this link to somebody via direct message, because at least when it's that, And so I could shoot it over to her in an email, a text message. I could get the link to people if I really want to. The problem with how particularly Meta Facebook handled this, and as Mark Zuckerberg recently explained, they turned down the algorithm on the news story. And so everybody who was posting it, trying to share it, well, Facebook was not going to put it out there or let that be seen by your friends, by the people who follow you. And so in that way is even, I think, a more nefarious way of suppressing what turned out to be a legitimate news story. Of course, the emails on the laptop were confirmed, and Biden went on to pardon his son Hunter for, the crimes that could have been discovered, that were discovered on this laptop, which, would suggest that there is a meaningful level of guilt here. So on Monday, Trump signed an executive order slamming the signatories for weaponizing the intelligence community against the American people. The executive order said, the signatories willfully weaponized the gravitas of the intelligence community to manipulate the political process and undermine our democratic institutions. This fabrication of the intelligence community to suppress information essential to the American people during a presidential election is an egregious breach of trust reminiscent of the Third World. Trump then directs the revocation of any active or current security clearances held by the signatories to this letter, and that includes James Clapper, Michael Hayden, Leon Panetta, John Brennan, Michael Morrell. Now, there are 51 signatories to the letter. 2 have since died, so obviously they don't have security clearances. And the 50th person is John Bolton, who Trump said was also included in the executive order over content published in his 2019 book. One of the allegations is that Hunter Biden profited by selling his father's political influence in the Obama administration. In 2014, then Vice President Biden was a key player in crafting the White House's Ukraine policy. He played a role in facilitating the 2014 coup in Ukraine, later showing his significant influence over Kiev. In 2018, Biden bragged that he threatened to withhold a loan in order to get Ukraine's top prosecutor fired. And so, that just goes to show the significance of the Biden's influence. So at the time the elder Biden held sway over Ukraine, Hunter received a lucrative job with energy giant Burisma. Emails from the laptop show that the younger Biden introduced Joe to a top executive at the energy firm. And so, again, with the amount of leverage Biden had in Ukraine at the time, it's very well possible that he was able to, in this back doorway with Hunter, signal to the Burisma, the Ukrainian government, that he wanted the contract to go to Burisma, or even if it wasn't that coordinated. Biden, remember, got the Ukrainian prosecutor general fired, right? He said, we'll withhold $1 billion loan from you. And then they fired him. And so if he was able to do that, that was noticed by Ukrainians, right? Like, it's very important to understand that from the perspective of Americans, you would think, how does that necessarily coordinate with his son getting a job, or why would Burisma want to hire Joe Biden? But think of if somebody came into the United States of America, or say, for example, Elon Musk comes in, right? And he basically tells Donald Trump that if he wants money for his inauguration, the campaign, something like that, he has to agree to fire the sitting attorney general. Well, then you would feel like Elon Musk is probably the most, or one of the most important people in the United States of America. And so, just being seen with him, being friends with him, people knowing that you and him have a relationship is going to get you a lot of benefits. It's going to make a lot of political headway for you. People may be afraid of targeting you if you are doing something corrupt, because they know that you have this very important backing behind you. And so my guess is that it probably did have quite a significant impact on Ukraine, and was the reason why Hunter Biden was making, I think, $80,000 to $100,000 a month while working for Burisma. All right. And so I want to just mention on this story, I think this is one of the positive signs that I've seen from the second Trump administration. Of course, as a libertarian, the pardoning of Ross Ulbricht is up there. Some of the executive orders, as it applies to, say, preventing censorship on social media or online, the postponing the banning of TikTok, which we'll talk about later. Those are all kind of good steps. However, none of that signals a fundamental difference that the second Trump administration will be different than the first. This is, I think, the only thing I see that does that. It shows that, at least to some degree, Trump has started to understand what happened to him in 2016 to 2020. My biggest complaint about Trump over the past 4 years, or really the past 8 years, is that he was never able to articulate what the Russiagate scam was, and how the intelligence community, the justice system, the political process in America was weaponized against him by first the Hillary Obama campaign administration, and then the Biden campaign, and destroyed. I guess, Trump still could have done a lot during his first presidency, but certainly without the cloud of Russiagate hanging over his head, I think it's very easy to argue that Russiagate destroyed his first presidency. And so, if you consider that they tried to tank his first campaign, they destroyed his first presidency, they destroyed his second campaign, Trump should hate these people, right? And he should see these people as the enemy. Now, these people are also our enemies. They also hate us. As John Brennan once said, listing off the nefarious actors in America, even libertarians, right? Like, these people are against us. And so that Donald Trump has now realized that they hate him, that they're his enemy, he could then, take some steps to disempower them. Let's hope that this applies to other policy making, other decision making. The concern here is that he has surrounded himself with people like Marco Rubio, who certainly Marco Rubio's worldview is far more in line with Bolton, Brennan, Hayden, Morell than it is Donald Trump, right? And if Donald Trump doesn't understand this, then he could allow another presidency to be hijacked and destroyed, maybe not by the exact same people, but by the same style of thinking and actors, the people who really do value the American empire, the deep state, over the sitting president, even if it's a member of their own party. All right, next up here, Trump orders 90-day pause on foreign development assistance. This one from Dave DeCamp, January 21st, antiwar.com. And so, again, we start off on some good news from Donald Trump, maybe the best there is. Now let's get into the bad. So President Trump has ordered a 90-day pause on what he calls foreign development assistance as one of his many executive orders signed on Monday. It's unclear how extensive the order is or if it will have any impact on military foreign aid to countries. Ukrainian officials say it doesn't apply to orders flowing to Ukraine or any economic aid that has already been approved by President Biden, and the order isn't expected to apply to weapon shipments to Israel. And I read this morning that it also will not apply to military aid to Jordan or Egypt as well, which those packages of military aid are seen as bribes to Cairo and Jordan in order to prevent any kind of tensions between those states and Israel. So it's really a bribe on behalf of the Israelis, paid for by the American taxpayer. So the Associated Press said it's not immediately clear how much assistance would be initially affected by Monday's order, as funding for many programs will already be appropriated by Congress, and it's obliged to be spent if not already spent. The purpose of the order is to review each program's efficiency and consistency with the United States foreign policy, a process overseen by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is one of the most hawkish members of Congress during his time in the Senate. The order reads that the policy of the United States that no further United States foreign assistance shall be dispersed in a manner that is not fully aligned with the foreign policy of the United States. And so my guess is that this is really about making sure there are no American funds returned to Palestinian organizations, particularly and most likely UNRWA, anytime soon. Now, I do believe that there is already an existing ban that Congress passed last year on appropriating funds to UNRWA that I think runs through May. And so this would only extend that by maybe a month or so, but still, I do think it's a signal that that is what is happening, that they are going to make sure no more American funds go to UNRWA, which of course is the Palestinian Aid Agency. And look, I'm not a libertarian. I'm not a fan of foreign aid. However, if we are going to, give money to someone in Israel, UNRWA is preventing a genocide. And when we give weapons to the Israeli military, it's causing one. And so obviously one of those is far more preferable to the other. All right, next up here, Trump places Cuba back on state sponsor of terrorism list. So President Trump has relisted Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism in one of the first foreign policy moves of his new administration. The move was included in an executive order Trump signed Monday that would rescind 78 of President Biden's executive actions. Biden only removed Cuba from the list last week. It was essentially guaranteed that Trump would reverse the move since his new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is very hawkish on Cuba and previously introduced legislation that would have prohibited the president from removing Havana from the list. U.S. officials in the Biden administration said they decided to lift the designation as a part of the deal brokered by the Catholic Church to release Cuban political prisoners. Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel said that he was freeing 553 prisoners in the spirit of the Vatican celebration of the Jubilee year in 2025 and did not specifically tie the reason to the U.S. lifting the designation. Still, it did seem like that was maybe all part of a good faith effort to okay, so not from the Biden administration, because lifting the terror designation on Cuba a week before leaving office, knowing that Trump is going to put it on, is not a goodwill gesture. However, maybe all of these things happening at the same time was an attempt to goose relationships between, improve them between just before Trump took office, and so this wouldn't happen, and of course we see it happen. So in response to Trump relisting Cuba, the Cuban foreign minister called the designation a tool of political coercion. Iran, North Korea, Syria are the only other countries listed as state sponsors of terrorism. The designation ensures harsh sanctions will remain, and these are a list of countries, well, no longer Syria, because Syria is now actually ruled by terrorists, and so we are no longer interested in regime change in Syria. But prior, this, is a list of countries that are on the top of the list for American improved regime change. So Cuba was first put on the list under the Reagan administration. The Obama administration removed Cuba from the list in 2015 as a part of steps taken towards normalization with Havana, but was relisted in 2021 by then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And just want to mention here, because I do think that this false narrative. So during the Trump administration, a lot of false narratives come out. Maybe one of the more nefarious that didn't get a lot of attention was Havana system. This allegation that CIA agents and U.S. diplomats, first in Cuba, then around the world, were being targeted by some futuristic Russian weapon that was scrambling their brains and making them have memory issues and headaches. All evidence points to this doesn't exist. It's psychosomatic. In Cuba, when this initially started, it was the sound of loud crickets that caused the headaches. And then other people just, they don't take cognitive tests very often. So at some point in people's lives, they start to diminish cognitively, in their 40s and 50s. And so they perform less well on tests in their 50s than they do their 40s. And rather than understanding that this is a general case of a decade-long plus cognitive decline, they attribute it to a loud noise that they heard, and suddenly we have Havana syndrome, and the Trump administration is using it to break ties with Cuba. And then of course the Biden administration really used it to try to demonize China and Russia. In fact, Kamala Harris was supposed to go to Vietnam at one point. They actually canceled her trip over the allegations of Havana syndrome. All right, moving on here. All right, so the last article here today dealing with Trump's executive orders. Trump signs order delaying TikTok ban. I wrote this one on the 21st at the Institute. So one of Trump's first acts as president was to order his attorney general to withhold enforcement of the ban on TikTok for over 2 months. Trump says he wants an agreement with 50% American ownership in the popular video sharing app. The executive order instructs Trump's pick for Attorney General, Pam Bondi, says, I hereby order the Attorney General to take any action on behalf of the United States to enforce the act for 75 days from the date of this order, to permit my administration an opportunity to determine the appropriate course of action with respect to TikTok. So in March, Biden signed a bill that ordered TikTok's Chinese owner ByteDance to divest its shares from the company within 6 months or face an effective ban in the United States. The deadline for ByteDance to sell TikTok was Sunday. TikTok was briefly unavailable, but Trump pledged to issue an executive order, and the platform quickly became available again to its 170 million American users. Trump plans to use the 75-day period to negotiate a partial sale of TikTok to American ownership. In a post on Truth Social, Trump demanded a 50% U.S. ownership of TikTok. He said, I would like the United States to have a 50% ownership in a joint venture. By doing this, we save TikTok, keep it in good hands, and allow it to stay up. Without U.S. approval, there is no TikTok. With our approval, it's worth hundreds of billions, maybe trillions. On Friday, President-elect Trump spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping. He described the call as going very good and said they discussed a range of issues, including TikTok. At the end of Trump's first term in office, he was a vocal advocate of banning TikTok, claiming the Chinese ownership of TikTok presented a national security threat. However, Capitol Hill lacked the political will to pass a bill banning TikTok until 2024. Congress was only motivated to pass the TikTok ban after content on the platform was overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian during the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. And so there's, quite a bit in here to break down, going forward in talking about this. So the first is that the ownership of TikTok. Now, ByteDance is actually only 40% owned by Chinese people. I think 20% is owned by the founder. Another 20% is owned by Chinese employees of ByteDance and Chinese investors. There's another 60% that's owned by a host, and I don't have a breakdown of international investment groups like Sequoia, right? These major firms. And so it would seem to me that over 50% of TikTok is likely already owned by firms that certainly are either American or have many Americans in them. So I'm a little confused by Trump's demand if he solely means that ByteDance is expected to sell off TikTok and it's expected to sell it off to at least a 50% American ownership. Now, when Trump says American ownership, that raises other questions. One of the suitors for TikTok has been Kevin O'Leary, who I'm sure most people know from the Shark Tank TV show. And, he's, I think, just kind of like brands himself as being a jerk, right? He wants TikTok and has offered, I think, 20 million or 20 billion, I guess, to buy the platform. And he's a Canadian, and so would he be able to buy it? These kind of things are unclear. There are plenty of rich people who are certainly tied into the West and even maybe the American government in the Trump orbit, who, if it does have to be an American ownership, wouldn't necessarily qualify for that. So there's a lot of questions about what Trump is actually demanding here. Another one is 75 days, a long enough period to really organize the sale of TikTok. And I guess there is always a possibility if they're moving in the right direction towards the sale, then Trump could just issue another executive order, delay it for another 75 or 90 days or whatever he thinks the time frame will be to get a deal done. But there's always the possibility here, of course, that TikTok doesn't end up getting sold, and what happens then. And, of course, anytime you talk about TikTok, just the political dynamics over the past 5 years, Trump being for the ban, then against the ban, Biden being against the ban, and then signing the ban into law, and then Congress only being willing to do so because the ban, TikTok was making Israel look bad. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Institute on the 20th. Putin congratulates Trump and says Moscow is ready for talks. So Russian President Vladimir Putin congratulated Donald Trump as he was inaugurated and offered to engage with the new president on Ukraine. Washington is Kiev's primary backer and will have to be involved in the talks to end the Ukraine war. So Putin said Monday, "We congratulate the U.S. president-elect on taking office. We are open to dialogue with the new administration on the Ukraine conflict." Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, arguing that it was necessary to secure Moscow's national defenses from the threat posed by Washington and NATO. Prior to the invasion, the Kremlin offered to engage with the Joe Biden administration to avert the conflict. One of Russia's core demands was a U.S. pledge that Ukraine would not join NATO, which the Biden administration refused to discuss. Shortly after the invasion, Russia and Ukraine nearly signed a deal brokered by NATO member Turkey, but the UK and US urged Kiev to forgo diplomacy, promising an endless supply of weapons and assistance. On the campaign trail, Trump vowed he would bring the war in Ukraine to an end on the first day of his administration, which obviously hasn't happened yet. Officials from the new Trump administration recently admitted the deal would likely take at least several months to reach. Putin said he wants to negotiate a long-term solution with Trump. The Russian leader explained, "It's the goal its goal should not be a short truce, not some kind of respite for regrouping forces and rearmament with the aim of subsequently continuing the conflict, but a long-term peace-based on respect for legitimate interests of all people, all nations that live in the region, Putin said. During his inaugural address on Monday, Trump said he wanted his legacy to be that of a peacemaker. However, members of Trump's foreign policy team have indicated that the new administration's policies may be quite similar to Biden's. Some of Trump's officials had said the U.S. will continue to ship arms to Ukraine and will only offered to delay Kiev's interest into NATO and not close the door to Ukraine, which would likely be unacceptable to Russia, and Sergei Lavrov has said as much in recent days. All right, now here's another positive from a member of the new Trump administration. This Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was sworn in on Tuesday, has said the war in Ukraine needs to end and that the new Trump administration will work to bring it to a close, although it's still not clear how it will happen. And so I have some doubts here. I really do wonder if Rubio is even going to have a heavy hand in the Ukraine portfolio. Maybe this is my incorrect bias about Marco Rubio, but he really seems like an idiot to me. In a way, this makes him a far less nefarious character than, say, an Antony Blinken, a Mike Pompeo, a Hillary Clinton, who may have the exact opposite views on the world as me, and I may be horrified by their views, but they were competent enough at their job to be able to carry out their worldview. Antony Blinken allowed Israel to wage a genocide in Gaza for 15 months, stood on stage every single day, or a member of his State Department did every single day and defended it, and got away with it, right? Like there is something impressive about what he was able to get away with. Hillary Clinton getting Obama to do the war in Libya, the regime change war, the dirty war in Syria, to orchestrate an election in Yemen. She had a real hand in remaking the Middle East, right? Libya is a failed state. Syria is now controlled by terrorists. The Houthis are in control of Yemen. So sure, it didn't exactly go how Hillary Clinton had planned, but still to be able to orchestrate those policies, sell those policies, start an undeclared war in Libya, to funnel a bunch of weapons to jihadist terrorists in Syria. These are things that the American people should be against, and Hillary Clinton was able to still get them done. I'm not sure Marco Rubio is of that same level of competence and intelligence to be able to sell nefarious policies. And so my guess is that Marco Rubio is not going to be in this position for long, and he's mostly going to concern himself with Latin America, where he is a real hawk. Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, I think should all be very concerned about the incoming Marco Rubio stint at the State Department. My guess is that Keith Kellogg is going to be mostly in charge. Maybe other figures like Mike Waltz as well will have a lot of say and will be in charge of the Ukraine file and not Rubio. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I'm not very optimistic that Rubio is going to be, involved in the Ukraine talks to a great degree. And the only reason that you would even want to be optimistic about that is because he's now saying he hopes the war will come to an end. All right, so during Trump's marathon signing of different executive orders on Monday into Tuesday, Monday night he was giving a little, presser as he's reading and signing these documents. And, in a way, it's very good to be back in the Trump era because it does feel so much more unscripted and adversarial, his relationship with the mainstream media, where all the events by Biden, it just seemed like a giggling press corps, softball questions. And as an audience, you don't learn anything by that. It's a performance. It's a show where this feels like at least a real back and forth between a president and a media who are not supposed to be directly aligned with the president. And so that I do think is something of a positive sign. So during his statement, Trump said, "I'm not confident. It's not our war. It's their war. I'm not confident, but I think they're very weakened on the other side." So that he's talking about Hamas. And when asked about the future of Gaza, he said it looked like a massive demolition site, but that it was a phenomenal location on the sea, saying, everything's good. It's like some beautiful things could be done with it. And if this is his perspective, that from a land developer, we've already heard, I think it was Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, who said that, this could be developed and turned into a luxury resort area and things like that once the Palestinians are gone. This statement, I don't think is a very good sign for the Palestinians moving forward here. Now, this one was interesting. Jakarta unaware of reported plan to relocate Palestinians to Indonesia. So on Monday, the Indonesian government said it was unaware of any plan to temporarily relocate Palestinians living in Gaza to Indonesia after NBC News reported the Trump administration was considering the idea. The NBC report cited a Trump official who said there were discussions about relocating Palestinians during the reconstruction in Gaza and said Indonesia was among the locations under discussion where some of them could go. In response to the report, the Indonesian foreign minister said it was the first time they heard about the idea. The Palestinians in Gaza may be hesitant, and I think should be very hesitant to leave, because if they do, I think it's almost impossible that the Israelis will allow them back. So, with Trump back in office, Israel is expecting Trump to resume the supply of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. This has been something that the Biden administration has postponed because Israel was using them in attacks on densely packed civilian areas. I do expect that the Trump administration is going to go through with that. Palestinians right now in Gaza, just mentioned what's going on there. People are dying. The ceasefire is loosely holding. It seems that Israel is taking an advantage to kill a few Palestinians here and there, but it's certainly not the level of destruction that we have seen before. And Palestinians have been able to return to what is left of their homes, the pile of rubble that their home once sat on in the north in Jabalia and even in the south to Rafah. So that's probably a tiny bit of good news that everybody isn't all shoved in the al-Mawasi camp anymore. However, it's an absolute horror show. Palestinians dug 68 more bodies out of the Gaza rubble, and this is increasing the death toll. So Gaza's health ministry said it received a total of 72 bodies over the previous 24-hour period, including 68 that were dug out of the rubble and one person who died of previously sustained injuries. Al Jazeera reported that 3 Palestinians, including a small child, were killed by Israeli snipers on Monday, despite the ceasefire. On Tuesday, Wafa reported another Palestinian was killed by Israeli gunfire near the southern city of Rafah. So again, the killing's not done, it's just slowed down. Now, with everything happening in Gaza, Israel is launching a major offensive in the West Bank, and the Israeli military has launched a major offensive in the Israeli occupied West Bank on Tuesday, focused on the northern city of Jenin, which came just days after a ceasefire in Gaza took effect. The Palestinian Health Ministry said at least 9 Palestinians have been killed and 40 wounded by the Israeli attack. Several doctors and nurses were among the wounded. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced Israel had begun what he called an extensive and significant military operation to defeat terrorism in Jenin, dubbing it an iron wall. The Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that Israeli warplanes and drones launched airstrikes on Jenin, and Israeli forces invaded the city with many armored vehicles. Israeli snipers were also deployed for the assault. The Quds Brigade, the armed wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, said its fighters based in Jenin were confronting the invading Israeli forces and fired heavy volleys of bullets. So far, there is no word on Israeli casualties. Palestinian Islamic Jihad said the purpose of the offensive was for Netanyahu to save his faltering government coalition as he faced resignations for the Gaza ceasefire deal. A statement from the organization said, "We call on our people throughout the occupied West Bank to confront this criminal campaign by all means, thwart its goals, and consolidate the enemy's defeat in subduing the will of our people in Gaza and the West Bank." So the Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who threatened his religious Zionism party would quit the government if the genocidal war in Gaza doesn't resume, said the West Bank offensive wasn't part of a deal he made with Netanyahu. And he wrote on X, "This is a part of our war goals that were added to the cabinet demanded for religious Zionism on Friday." Smotrich, a West Bank settler who has long called for the annexation of the territory, said the operation was launched to protect legal settlements. Iron Wall will be a strong and ongoing campaign against the elements of terrorism and its perpetrators, to protect the settlement and the settlers, and for the security of the entire state of Israel, which the settlement of the security belt, he said. The Trump administration is expected to be more supportive of Israeli government plans to expand settlements in the West Bank, and one of Trump's early executive orders was lifting sanctions the Biden administration placed on violent settlers. And there are some reports that Trump, in part of accepting $100 million from Miriam Adelson, had agreed to allow Israel to annex the West Bank during his second administration. All right, last up here, Israel's top general to step down over failure to prevent October 7th attack. I wrote this one for the Institute on January 21st, and there's not a whole lot to get into here. It's just interesting that the IDF chief of staff, who is Israel's top-ranking general, stepped down after what seemed like pressure from Netanyahu, Defense Minister Israel Katz, and right-wing members of the Israeli government. The Jerusalem Post reported that Netanyahu and Katz are working, did that and worked and got the top general to step down. So most of the blame for the security failures on October 7th falls on the IDF and not the prime minister. Also, some some far-right members of the Israeli government have attacked the retiring top general. That is, by the way, Herzi Havalvi, and they attacked him because he has said things like Netanyahu hasn't given us what we, the kind of the goals or the structure to win the offensive or the war in Gaza, that Netanyahu's goals of achieving Hamas were unachievable. And so he had, I think, kind of fallen out of favor because he wasn't quite as dedicated to the genocide as, say, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, Netanyahu, and others are. All right, everyone, that will do it for the show today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And just remember, there will be another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show out later today. I think we're going to try to stream it live about 4:45. So be sure to subscribe to that channel. First link in the show notes page. Thank you all.